The Black Hills of South Dakota stretched endlessly under the harsh summer sun of 1887, their rugged beauty hiding the violence and desperation that characterized life in the territory surrounding Deadwood. Jake Morrison had been prospecting these hills for 15 years, long enough to know every creek, every ridge, and every hidden valley where a man might find gold or simply find peace away from the chaos of the mining camps. At 58, Jake was one of the old-timers, a veteran of the Colorado Gold Rush who had drifted north when the easy pickings played out and the big mining companies moved in with their machinery and hired guns. His claim lay in a remote valley 20 miles from Deadwood, far enough from the main camps to avoid most of the trouble, but close enough to civilization that he could trade his modest findings for supplies when necessary. Jake had chosen isolation deliberately, preferring the company of mountains and silence to the violence and corruption that dominated territorial life. He had seen too much killing, too much greed, and too much of what men became when they thought gold was more important than human decency. His simple cabin and basic mining equipment represented a conscious choice to live simply and leave a small footprint on the land that had become his home. It was while checking his trap lines in the early morning that Jake first saw her, a Native American woman, probably in her 30s, lying motionless beside a small stream that fed into the creek near his claim. At first glance, he thought she might be sleeping, but as he approached, the unnatural stillness of her body and the pallor of her skin made it clear that she had died sometime during the night. She was Lakota, judging by her clothing and the traditional beadwork on her dress, and she had clearly been traveling on foot for some time before exhaustion and exposure had claimed her life. Jake knelt beside the woman's body, noting the careful way she had been prepared for travel despite her obvious poverty. Her dress, though worn and dusty from hard travel, had been mended with meticulous care, and her long black hair was braided with small ornaments that spoke of cultural pride despite desperate circumstances. Most tellingly, she clutched a small bundle against her chest, a cradle board that had been crafted with the kind of love and attention that only a mother could provide. The baby inside the cradle board was alive but weak, perhaps 6 months old, with the large dark eyes and bronze skin that marked him as the woman's son. The child was dehydrated and hungry, but the soft sounds he made suggested that he had enough strength to survive if he received immediate care. Jake realized that the woman had died protecting her baby, using her own body heat and the last of her strength to keep him alive during what must have been a desperate flight from some threat that had driven them into the wilderness. Jake had no idea what circumstances had brought a Lakota mother and child to his remote valley, but the evidence suggested that she had been fleeing from danger and had died just short of whatever safety she had been seeking. The territorial conflicts between white settlers and Native American tribes had created countless refugees, and this woman was clearly one of the victims of a larger tragedy that had torn her away from her community and family. Looking at her peaceful face and protective way she held her child even in death, Jake felt profound sadness and respect for her courage and maternal devotion. Jake carefully lifted the baby from his mother's arms, noting how the cradle board had been designed to protect the child from the elements while allowing the mother to travel quickly on foot. The craftsmanship was exquisite, willow branches woven with sinew and decorated with traditional patterns that told stories of family history and tribal identity. Someone had spent many hours creating this carrier, probably the baby's grandmother or another female relative who had anticipated the need for the young family to travel under difficult circumstances. The baby was clearly hungry and thirsty, but he accepted Jake's gentle handling with the trusting acceptance of someone too young to understand danger. Jake had no experience caring for infants, but his practical frontier skills told him that the child's immediate needs were simple: warmth, water, and nourishment. The challenge would be providing these necessities with the limited resources available at his isolated mining claim. While caring for the baby, Jake also faced a more complex question of what to do about the woman's body. Leaving it exposed to scavengers was unthinkable, but he also understood that Native American burial customs were different from white traditions and that he might inadvertently show disrespect through ignorance of proper procedures. His solution was to draw on his own memories of burial practices he had witnessed during his years in the Colorado Territory, where he had occasionally interacted with Native American communities during more peaceful periods. Jake spent the morning caring for the baby and preparing for the burial that would take place at sunset. He diluted some of his preserved milk with water to create a substance the infant could digest, feeding him carefully with a clean cloth used as a makeshift nursing aid. The baby accepted this improvised meal hungrily, and his improved alertness and color suggested that he would survive the crisis that had claimed his mother's life. The cradle board contained a few precious possessions that told part of the woman's story: a small pouch of traditional medicines, a carefully wrapped bundle of cornmeal, and a piece of paper with writing in both English and what appeared to be Lakota pictographs. Jake couldn't read the native writing, but the English portion identified the woman as Mary Crow Dog and indicated that she had been trying to reach the Pine Ridge Agency, where she apparently had relatives who could care for her and her son. The document was dated 3 weeks earlier and bore the official seal of the Territorial Indian Agent, suggesting that Mary had been traveling under some kind of official authorization or protection. But whatever had driven her to make such a dangerous journey with an infant remained a mystery that would probably never be fully understood. As the day progressed, Jake found himself thinking about Mary Crow Dog's final hours and the determination that had brought her so close to safety before exhaustion and exposure had overcome her strength. She had managed to travel nearly 200 miles on foot, carrying her baby, and probably walking mostly at night to avoid the hostile attention that a lone Native American woman would have attracted during daylight hours. The fact that she had died within a day's walk of the Pine Ridge Agency made her death particularly tragic, representing the failure of a heroic effort that had almost succeeded. Jake had seen many deaths during his years in territories, some violent, some peaceful, some heroic, and some senseless, but Mary Crow Dog's death affected him more deeply than most. Perhaps it was the evidence of her maternal devotion, or perhaps it was a recognition that her suffering represented something larger than individual tragedy. Whatever the reason, Jake felt a responsibility to ensure that her burial honored both her courage and the cultural traditions that had shaped her identity. As the afternoon sun began to descend toward the western mountains, Jake began the careful process of preparing Mary Crow Dog's body for burial according to what he understood of Lakota traditions. His knowledge was incomplete and probably imperfect, drawn from observations during his years in the territories and conversations with Native Americans who had been willing to share such information with a respectful white man. But he was determined to do the best he could with the knowledge and resources available to him. Jake had chosen a burial site on a low hill overlooking the valley, a location that provided both natural beauty and protection from scavengers while maintaining the kind of elevated position that many Native American cultures considered appropriate for the final resting place of the dead. The site was naturally sheltered by pine trees and offered a clear view of the mountains that had been Mary's destination during her final journey. Using tools from his mining operation, Jake began the laborious process of digging a proper grave in the rocky soil of the Black Hills. The work was difficult and time-consuming, but he approached it with the same careful attention to detail that he brought to all his endeavors. This was not just about disposing of a body, but about showing respect for a human being whose courage and determination had earned his admiration even though he had never known her in life. While digging, Jake found himself thinking about the baby who was now sleeping peacefully in an improvised cradle he had constructed from his own blankets and a wooden crate. The child would need ongoing care that Jake was not equipped to provide, and get him to relatives at Pine Ridge would require a journey that carried its own risks and complications. But those were problems for tomorrow. Today's responsibility was ensuring that Mary Crow Dog received the dignified burial that her sacrifice deserved. As the grave took shape, Jake gathered stones from a hillside to create a traditional cairn that would mark the burial site and protect it from disturbance. He had seen similar stone arrangements at Native American burial grounds during his travels, and while he couldn't replicate the specific ceremonial aspects that he didn't understand, he could at least create a monument that reflected respect for the cultural traditions that had guided Mary's life. The baby woke as Jake was completing his preparations, and the sound of infant crying seemed somehow appropriate as a kind of mourning song for the mother who had given her life to ensure his survival. Jake fed the child again and wrapped him warmly in clean blankets. Understanding that the baby's presence at his mother's burial was both natural and necessary according to most Native American customs he was familiar with. As the sun began to set, painting the Black Hills in shades of gold and red that reminded Jake of the sacred colors he had seen in Native American ceremonies, he carefully wrapped Mary Crow Dog's body in his best blankets and carried her to the grave he had prepared. The physical act of lifting and moving her body brought home the reality of her death in a way that simply looking at her had not. She was gone, her spirit had departed, and only the shell of someone who had been a mother, daughter, and member of a community remained to be returned to the earth. Jake placed Mary's body in the grave with as much dignity and gentleness as he could manage, arranging her position so that she faced east toward the rising sun, a practice he had observed at other Native American burials. He included in the grave the small bundle of personal possessions that had traveled with her, understanding that these items were meant to accompany her spirit on whatever journey lay beyond death. As the sun touched the western horizon, Jake stood beside Mary Crow Dog's grave and struggled to find words that would honor her memory and acknowledge the significance of what had transpired. He was not an eloquent man, and he had no formal religious training that might have provided appropriate prayers or ceremonies for such a moment. But he understood that some words needed to be spoken, some recognition given a life that had ended and the courage that had been displayed during its final chapter. "Mary Crow Dog," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "I didn't know you in life, but I've seen enough to know that you were a good mother and a brave woman. You carried your son across 200 miles of dangerous country, and you kept him alive when anyone else would have given up. That takes a kind of strength that most people never have to find, and I want you to know that your sacrifice won't be forgotten." Jake paused, looking down at the small bundle that contained the baby who had inspired such devotion and determination. "I don't know what drove you from your home or what you were running from, but I know you were trying to reach safety for your boy. You came so close to making it, and I'm sorry that the journey was just a little too long for your strength to carry you all the way." The words felt inadequate to express the depth of respect and sorrow he felt, but they were honest and spoken with genuine emotion. Jake had been present at many deaths during his frontier years, but few had affected him as deeply as this encounter with a woman whose name he had learned only from a piece of paper and whose story he could only guess at from the evidence she had left behind. "I promise you that I'll get your son to Pine Ridge, to your family," Jake continued, making a commitment that he knew would be difficult and potentially dangerous to fulfill. "He'll grow up knowing about his mother's courage and the price you paid to give him a chance at life. And I'll make sure this grave is marked properly so that your people can find it and honor you according to their own customs." Jake had learned enough about Native American spiritual beliefs to understand that the dead were not considered gone but transformed, remaining connected to the living through memory, tradition, and the ongoing responsibilities of family and community. By promising to care for Mary's son and to preserve the memory of her sacrifice, he was acknowledging those connections and accepting a role in maintaining them despite the cultural differences that separated his world from hers. As darkness settled over the Black Hills, Jake lit a small fire beside the grave, using techniques he had learned from Native American friends during more peaceful times in his past. The fire was meant to guide Mary's spirit on its journey to whatever afterlife awaited her, while also providing light and warmth for the baby, who would spend his first night as an orphan under protection of a stranger who had committed himself to honoring his mother's memory. The flames danced in the evening breeze, casting shadows that seemed to move like spirits across the stone cairn that marked Mary's final resting place. Jake sat beside the fire holding the baby, who seemed comforted by the warmth and the gentle sounds of the burning wood. The night was clear and cold, with stars beginning to appear in a vast sky that stretched endlessly above the mountains and valleys of the Dakota Territory. It was the kind of night that made a person aware of both their own insignificance and their connection to something larger than individual existence, exactly the kind of setting that seemed appropriate for contemplating questions of life, death, and the responsibilities that the living owed to those who had passed on. Jake woke at dawn to discover that he and the baby were no longer alone in the valley. During the night, while he had slept fitfully beside the dying embers of Mary Crow Dog's funeral fire, the surrounding hills had become populated with silent figures who watched his camp with the patient stillness of people who had learned to observe without being observed. At first, Jake thought he might be seeing things, shadows created by the early morning light playing tricks on his tired eyes. But as he became more fully awake and his vision adjusted to the dim light, he realized that the figures were real and numerous, positioned on every ridge and hilltop that commanded a view of Mary's grave. They were Native Americans, probably Lakota like Mary herself, and they had clearly been watching his camp for some time, without making their presence known. The discovery should have been frightening. Jake was alone and outnumbered by what appeared to be a substantial war party that could have killed him at any time during the night if that had been their intention. But something about their behavior suggested that they had not come for violence. They remained motionless and silent, neither advancing nor retreating, as if they were waiting for something or simply bearing witness to what had transpired on the hilltop where Mary lay buried. Jake counted at least 50 mounted figures on the surrounding ridges, though the actual number might have been larger since some could have been hidden by the terrain. They were arranged in a loose circle around his camp, close enough to observe clearly but far enough away to avoid appearing immediately threatening. Most carried traditional weapons, bows, lances, and war clubs, but Jake also saw evidence of more modern firearms that suggested these were experienced warriors who had adapted to the changing realities of frontier conflict. The baby in Jake's arms stirred restlessly, perhaps sensing the tension in the air or responding to some sound or scent that his caregiver couldn't detect. Jake fed him again using his improvised nursing setup, noting how the child's alertness and color continued to improve with proper nutrition and care. Whatever hardships the baby had endured during his mother's final journey, he possessed the resilience and strength necessary to survive and eventually thrive under better circumstances. As the sun climbed higher and the light improved, Jake began to make out more details about the silent watchers. They were not all warriors. Among the mounted figures, he could see women, children, and elderly men whose presence suggested that this was not a war party, but a community gathering of some kind. The implications of such a gathering were unclear, but the absence of immediately hostile action suggested that Jake's treatment of Mary Crow Dog's body had not offended tribal customs or triggered the kind of revenge that white men had learned to fear when dealing with Native American communities. One figure in particular commanded Jake's attention, an elderly man mounted on a magnificent painted horse, positioned at the center of the group on the highest ridge. Even at a distance, this individual radiated the kind of authority and dignity that marked him as a leader of considerable importance. His war bonnet and ceremonial dress suggested high rank within the tribal hierarchy, and his positioning indicated that he was probably the person who would determine how this unprecedented situation would be resolved. Jake made a decision that surprised him with its boldness. Leaving the baby safely wrapped in blankets beside the grave, he walked slowly toward the base of the hill where the leader waited, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. It was a gesture of respect and peaceful intention, acknowledging the authority of the tribal leader while demonstrating his willingness to communicate rather than fight. The elderly chief watched Jake's approach without moving, his weathered face revealing nothing about his thoughts or intentions. When Jake reached a point about 50 yards from the base of the chief's hill, he stopped and waited, understanding that protocol required the tribal leader to make the next move in whatever conversation was about to take place. The elderly chief urged his horse forward, descending from his elevated position with the measured dignity of someone accustomed to formal negotiations and diplomatic encounters. As he drew closer, Jake could see that this was a man of considerable age and experience, his face bearing the ceremonial scars and weathered lines that spoke of decades spent leading his people through the violent transitions that had characterized relations between Native Americans and white settlers throughout the latter half of the 19th century. When the chief reached the bottom of the hill, he dismounted and approached Jake on foot, a gesture that acknowledged equality between them despite the overwhelming numerical advantage that his warriors maintained. He was tall and straight despite his advanced years, moving with the controlled grace of someone who had spent his entire life on horseback and in command of others. His clothing was a mixture of traditional elements and practical adaptations, beaded buckskin decorated with eagle feathers and traditional symbols, but also modern boots and a cartridge belt that spoke of familiarity with contemporary warfare. "I am Chief Standing Bearer of the Brule Lakota," he said in English that was precise and unaccented, clearly the result of years spent negotiating with territorial and federal officials. "The woman you buried was my daughter." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow, reordering everything he thought he understood about the situation. Mary Crow Dog had not been a random refugee, but the daughter of one of the most important tribal leaders in the region, and her death represented not just personal tragedy, but a significant loss to the entire Lakota community. The implications for Jake's own safety were immediately clear. He had become involved in a family matter of the highest importance, and his actions would be judged not just by their intentions, but by their effects on tribal relationships and community stability. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jake said quietly, recognizing the inadequacy of the words, but feeling compelled to express his condolences. "I did the best I could to honor her memory and care for her son." Standing Bear's dark eyes studied Jake's face with the intensity of someone who had spent decades learning to read character and motivation in the expressions and bearing of both allies and enemies. What he saw seemed to satisfy some internal evaluation, because his stern expression softened slightly as he nodded his acknowledgement of Jake's words. "My daughter was fleeing from men who sought to harm her and take her child," Standing Bear explained, his voice carrying the weight of grief and anger carefully controlled. "She was trying to reach her relatives at Pine Ridge, where federal protection might have kept them safe. She came very close to succeeding in her mission." The chief's eyes moved to the hilltop, where Mary's grave was marked by the stone cairn that Jake had constructed, and Jake could see the pain that even this strong man felt at the loss of a child. "I have been told that you cared for her body with respect, that you buried her according to traditions that honor the dead, and that you have protected her son from harm. This creates obligations and relationships that transcend the differences between our peoples." Standing Bear paused, his gaze returning to Jake's face. "Why did you do these things? You owe my family nothing, and helping Indians can bring trouble from your own people. What moved you to show such respect to strangers?" It was a question that Jake had been asking himself since the previous evening, and he found that he didn't have a simple or entirely rational answer. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "Because she was a mother who died protecting her child, and that deserves respect regardless of race or politics. And because—" He paused, struggling to articulate something he barely understood himself. "Because there's been too much death and suffering in this territory already. Maybe it's time someone tried to show that white men and Indians can treat each other with dignity and honor." Standing Bear nodded slowly, seeming to approve of both Jake's honesty and his underlying motivation. "You speak with wisdom beyond your years, and your actions demonstrate the kind of character that my people value above all other qualities. This will not be forgotten. What happened next will be remembered and spoken of in both Native American and white communities for generations to come." Standing Bear raised his hand, and the silent watchers who had been positioned on the surrounding hills began to move, not in the coordinated charge that Jake had feared, but in a carefully orchestrated procession that spoke of ceremony rather than war. They descended from their positions carrying objects that Jake couldn't identify at first, but which gradually resolved into bundles of wildflowers and medicinal plants that had been gathered from throughout the Black Hills region. The sight was unlike anything Jake had ever witnessed or imagined. Hundreds of Native Americans, men, women, children, and elders, moved across this valley with the quiet dignity of people participating in a sacred ceremony. They came on horseback and on foot, some leading pack animals loaded with what appeared to be supplies and gifts, others carrying traditional ceremonial objects that caught the morning sunlight and reflected it in brilliant flashes of color and movement. At the head of the procession walked a group of elderly women who carried themselves with the special authority that Native American cultures accorded to grandmothers and keepers of tradition. They moved directly toward Mary Crow Dog's grave, their arms filled with flowers that had been selected and arranged according to principles that Jake didn't understand but could recognize as deeply meaningful. Behind them came the warriors, no longer positioned for observation or potential conflict, but arranged in ceremonial formation that honored their fallen sister and the white man who had shown her proper respect. The entire gathering moved with the synchronized precision of people who performed similar ceremonies many times before, creating a river of humanity that flowed across the landscape with purpose and grace. As they reached the hilltop where Mary lay buried, the participants in this unprecedented ceremony began to distribute flowers across the entire area, not just on grave itself, but throughout Jake's camp, across the valley floor, and even on the equipment and structures that marked his mining claim. The flowers were not randomly scattered, but placed according to patterns that suggested deep cultural significance, creating designs that told stories and conveyed meanings that transcended language barriers. Jake found himself standing in the midst of what could only be described as a living garden, surrounded by colors and fragrances that transformed the harsh landscape of his mining claim into something approaching paradise. The flowers included varieties he recognized, wild roses, lupins, and Indian paintbrush, but also plants that were unfamiliar to him but clearly held special significance in Lakota tradition. The elderly women worked with practiced efficiency, their movements guided by knowledge that had been passed down through generations of similar ceremonies. As they worked, some of the women began to sing in voices that rose and fell like wind to the mountains, creating harmonies that seemed to make the very air vibrate with emotion and spiritual power. The song was hauntingly beautiful, telling stories of loss and remembrance, of honor and respect, of the connections that bound all living things together in an endless cycle of life, death, and renewal. Other members of the gathering joined their voices to the chorus, creating a sound that seemed to encompass the entire valley and echo off the surrounding hills. Jake realized that he was witnessing something extraordinary, not just a funeral ceremony for Mary Crow Dog, but a formal recognition of his own actions and character. The flowers being scattered across his land were not just decorations, but symbols of acceptance and honor, markers that would identify his claim as a place where respect and dignity had triumphed over prejudice and fear. Standing Bear approached Jake as the ceremony reached its climax, carrying a small bundle that he presented with formal solemnity. "These are gifts from my people," he said, "tokens of respect for the honor you have shown to our daughter and the care you have provided for her son." The gifts that Standing Bear presented represented more than simple tokens of gratitude. They were formal symbols of adoption into the extended Lakota community, markers that would identify Jake as someone under tribal protection regardless of whatever conflicts might arise between their peoples in the future. The bundle contained a magnificent war bonnet, crafted with eagle feathers and traditional beadwork, a sacred pipe that had been carved from red stone and decorated with symbols representing spiritual protection, and a beautifully worked buckskin shirt that bore the clan markings of Standing Bear's own family. "These gifts carry great responsibility," Standing Bear explained as Jake examined each item with obvious reverence and appreciation. "The bonnet marks you as an honorary war chief, entitled to speak in our councils and claim the protection of our warriors. The pipe connects you to the spiritual traditions of our people and obligates you to use its power only for good purposes. The shirt makes you a member of my family, with all the rights and duties that such membership entails." Jake felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered to him. He had performed what seemed like a simple act of human decency, but it was being acknowledged as something far more significant. A bridge between cultures that had been at war for decades, and a demonstration that understanding and respect were possible even in the midst of seemingly irreconcilable conflict. "I'm honored beyond words," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not sure I understand what these gifts mean for the future. What am I being asked to do with these responsibilities?" Standing Bear smiled, the expression transforming his stern features and revealing the warmth and humor that lay beneath his formal dignity. "You are being asked to continue being the man you have already shown yourself to be, someone who sees human beings rather than enemies, someone who honors the dead regardless of their race, and someone who protects children because they deserve protection." The chief paused, his expression becoming more serious as he addressed the practical implications of what was being proposed. "But you're also being asked to serve as a bridge between our peoples when such bridging becomes necessary. There will be times when misunderstandings arise, when violence threatens, when cooler heads and wiser voices are needed to prevent tragedy. In such times, your voice will be heard by both communities because you have earned respect from both." As the ceremony continued around them, Jake began to understand that he was witnessing the creation of something unprecedented in the history of white Indian relations in the Dakota Territory. The formal adoption of a white man into Lakota society, conducted in full view of hundreds of tribal members and with the explicit approval of their most important leaders, represented a new model for how the two cultures might coexist despite their differences. The baby who had been the innocent catalyst for all these developments was formally presented to the assembled community as Standing Bear's grandson, heir to his mother's place in tribal society, an inheritor of her memory. But rather than being taken away to be raised entirely within Lakota culture, the child would remain with Jake while also maintaining connections to his Native American heritage through regular visits and participation in tribal ceremonies. It was an arrangement that recognized the practical realities of the baby's situation while ensuring that he would grow up understanding both worlds and capable of moving between them as circumstances required. The ceremony concluded with a feast that had been prepared by the women of the community, featuring traditional foods that had been brought from tribal lands many miles away. Jake found himself seated beside Standing Bear at the center of the gathering, formally recognized as a guest of honor and family member despite the fact that just 24 hours earlier he had been a complete stranger to everyone present. As the sun began to set over the flower-covered valley, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that reminded everyone present of the sacred colors that figure prominently in Lakota's spiritual traditions, Jake reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in his life and in his understanding of what was possible between peoples who had been taught to view each other as enemies. Years passed, and the flower ceremony at Jake Morrison's mining claim became legendary throughout the Dakota Territory, spoken of in both Native American and white communities as proof that respect and understanding could triumph over hatred and fear. The baby who had been the innocent catalyst of the entire event grew into a strong, intelligent young man who moved easily between both worlds, equally comfortable participating in Lakota ceremonies and attending the territorial schools where he excelled in both traditional academics and cross-cultural communication. Jake himself had been transformed from an isolated prospector into a respected mediator and community leader, his unique position as an adopted member of Lakota society making him invaluable when conflicts arose between tribal communities and white settlers. His mining claim, still marked by the stone cairn that covered Mary Crow Dog's grave, became an unofficial meeting place where representatives of different communities could gather to resolve disputes and negotiate agreements without the formal constraints and prejudices that characterize official government dealings. The flowers that had been scattered across Jake's land during that remarkable ceremony had taken root and multiplied, creating a permanent garden that bloomed each summer with varieties of wildflowers that should not have been able to survive in the harsh conditions of the Black Hills. Botanists and naturalists who visited the site were unable to explain the phenomenon, but Native American visitors understood that something transcended natural law and fell into the realm of spiritual recognition. Standing Bear lived to see his grandson graduate from the Territorial College with honors in both engineering and Native American studies, the first person in the region to receive formal training that would allow him to serve as a bridge between traditional and modern ways of life. The old chief took particular pride in the young man's decision to return to the Black Hills and establish a school that would educate children from both communities, ensuring that future generations would grow up with better understanding of each other's cultures and values. The story of Mary Crow Dog's burial and the flower ceremony that followed was preserved in both oral traditions and written records, becoming part of the historical legacy of the Dakota Territory and serving as inspiration for later efforts to build understanding between Native American and white communities throughout the American West. The simple act of burying a stranger with dignity had grown into something far larger than anyone could have anticipated at the time. Jake's mining claim was eventually designated as a territorial monument, not because of any gold that had been found there, but because of the human gold that had been discovered in the form of compassion, respect, and the willingness of good people to recognize their common humanity despite the artificial barriers that history and politics had erected between them. Visitors to the site could still see Mary Crow Dog's grave, still marked by the original stone cairn, but now surrounded by a garden that bloomed perpetually with flowers that served as living testimony to the power of simple human decency. When Jake finally passed away at the advanced age of 87, his funeral was attended by representatives from communities throughout the region, both Native American and white, who had benefited from his unique role as a bridge between worlds. He was buried beside Mary Crow Dog on the hilltop that had become sacred to multiple communities, his own grave marked by a stone cairn similar to hers, but decorated with symbols from both cultures that he had learned to understand and respect. The baby he had rescued and raised became the guardian of both graves and the keeper of the story that connected them, ensuring that future generations would remember how a chant encounter between strangers had grown into a legacy of understanding that outlasted the conflicts and prejudices of their time. The flowers that marked the site continued to bloom each summer, tended by children from both communities who had learned to see the garden as a symbol of what was possible when people chose love over fear, respect over prejudice, and hope over despair. In the end, the story of Mary Crow Dog's burial became more than just a tale of individual kindness. It became a testament to the truth that human dignity knows no boundaries of race or culture, and that the smallest acts of compassion can create the largest changes in the world when they're performed with genuine respect for the humanity that connects all people across all the differences that seem to divide them.